On June 15th of 2012, then President Barack Obama was in Lower Manhattan. He ended up visiting the new Freedom Tower that day and signing his name on one of the last beams to be put in place. That was on June 15th of 2012, and I know this because I was also in Lower Manhattan that day. I was there with a group of people from St. Michael Lutheran Church. We had gone to the Queens area to do a trip together and do some projects, service project together, and we were visiting Manhattan that day. And I can't say that I even knew that President Obama was supposed to be there that day, but when you are in a place where the president crosses your path, or you cross the path of where they would be, you know it. So in Lower Manhattan that day, everything was very difficult, even more difficult to get around through than normal. It was locked down. There were people in full sort of SWAT or body armor with all sorts of weaponry. There were people all up on roofs with walkie-talkies and weapons there. The whole part of Lower Manhattan was on protective lockdown. And that's when I was like, well, what in the world is going on down here? And, found out later that day on the news that we had been so close to where President Obama was. Have you ever experienced coming across the presidential motorcade or presidential itinerary? Have you ever experienced this? I experienced it on June 15th, 2012. I experienced it another time too. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But this is preparing for Sunday. This is for Sunday, November 21st of 2021. Good morning, good afternoon. I hope all is well where this finds you. This is the end of the liturgical year. The church calendar is different than our normal calendar. November 21st is the last Sunday of the church year. From here on out, we will cycle over. We will go into year C of the lectionary, which is the Gospel of Luke. If you've watched any of these, you know that we've been in Mark. And I've told you that Mark's year also has some John mixed into it. We've been in year B, Mark. We're at the last Sunday of the church year now. This Sunday is called Christ the King Sunday. The idea is to crown the church year with the, eternal ascended Christ in all of his glory, sort of capstone it with that. I typically call this Reign of Christ. I don't call it Christ the King. I call it Reign of Christ because of some of that imagery I was just talking about. Christ the King makes it sound like God comes one way. Reign of Christ talks a little bit differently about how his kingdom is what it is. It's a little different. Maybe the comparison and the contrasting here has to do with that journey, that crossing paths with President Obama that day in Lower Manhattan, and how Jesus comes to us. And there's two ways to think about that, and that's really what I'm thinking about in this Preparing for Sunday. I'll ask it to you like this. I'll ask it for you like this. How do you imagine a king in medieval times living? How do you imagine that in comparison to the other folks that lived in the king's kingdom? Yeah, a king, would have a castle. The castle would have, walls, and I know not all of them had them, but you have this imagery of moats and drawbridges, and you have armed people all around them. You have the imagery of power and protection. You have all of the imagery of that. Sort of something I was trying to flesh out or talk a little bit about when I talked about that day in Lower Manhattan. Have you ever come across a presidential motorcade or presidential day where the itinerary was where you were. I once was driving through the Canton-Akron airport area and got all waylaid down through there because then President George H.W. Bush was coming in town, I think, to visit like Timken or something, and flew into Canton-Akron, and so all of that had all these armed people all over the place. And what I'm doing with that, and asking you to think about with that, is Christ the King? Is Christ the king in the castle with the all the protection and power, or is Christ coming something different? And that's why I don't call it Christ the King Sunday. I like to refer to it as Reign of Christ, because I think it shows us how God works, what his reign looks like, less than putting emphasis on how he's the king. But either way, Christ the King Sunday, Reign of Christ Sunday, this is the end of the liturgical year, and we're thinking about who Jesus is, and I guess we're thinking some of who Jesus isn't. When I asked you to think about then President Obama, then President George H.W. Bush, this is not who Jesus is, nor is this how he comes to us and dwells in our midst. If we hear anything from the testimony of the Bible, this is it, that Jesus isn't really a king the way that kings tend to look or feel. So Christ the King in year B, Reign of Christ as I would call it, in year B, typically rotates off of Mark and gives us a reading from the Gospel of John. John chapter 18, 33 through 37 is the prescribed reading for this Sunday, the end Sunday of this year. But mostly because I've been doing these preparing for Sundays, and also selfishly because Mark is my favorite gospel, I've been sticking with Mark more than rotating with the lectionary. I did this all the way back on Reformation Sunday. I stuck with Mark instead of rotating over to John. I did this on All Saints. Instead of rotating over to Matthew, I stuck with Mark. This Sunday gives no room for that. It's supposed to be Christ the King, and it's pretty much like you're supposed to do John 18. It doesn't even give you options. I just took my own option to stick with Mark instead of jumping over to John, so that I can sort of wrap up the themes that I've been talking about in preaching and in preparing for Sundays, and sort of give you the whole story of Mark instead of flip-flopping around all the Gospels, if that makes any sense. So we're supposed to have John 18, 33 through 37, which is John's telling of Jesus' interaction with Pilate. And it's a discussion back and forth about Jesus' kingship. And Pilate is a part of the political system of Rome and of Israel of the time, and so his concentration with Jesus is that one castle against that other castle. He's worried about people saying that they're kings and what their army will look like and what power they're going to come to take and how it'll test their protection. So Pilate is talking to Jesus about kingship. That happens in John chapter 18. That's the prescribed reading for Reign of Christ. However, I want to focus on Mark and what it tells us about who Jesus really is. And the lectionary gives no options for this. I just did it on my own. So what I did is I went to Mark, and I found the same readings in Mark that are of Jesus before Pilate that would run sort of side by side with the John telling of that story. So I just took the story that John tells and were prescribed, and then put the Mark version of it as our gospel reading for this Sunday. It's Mark 15, 1 through 20. Mark 15, 1 through 20. And what I'm talking to you about is running across the presidential appearance and all the protection and the power that rightfully goes into that, thinking about medieval castles or Roman power and how Jesus comes. And part of the way that this is shared with us is that the readings for Reign of Christ come from the midst of Jesus' passion story. So they come in the midst of Jesus' eventual crucifixion, really the culmination of John. It's towards the end of John. It's all the way at the end of Mark, basically. So that already begins to show that Jesus' reign is different, that Jesus comes to us in a different way. And I feel like Mark, which we've studied in these Preparing for Sundays more closely, really shows who Jesus is and how God works more clearly with this contrast than John does. Okay? So Mark 15, 1 through 20 has the same interaction, Jesus before Pilate, as John 18, 33 through 37 has. Mark 14 through 15 is prescribed for us in lectionary year B, just not on this Sunday. We've already read it this year. The Sunday that this appears is on what I call Passion Sunday, what's known as Palm Sunday, all the way back the week before Easter this year. All right? So that is prescribed for Mark 14 and 15, the whole Passion story as Mark tells it this year. And even then, we don't get the whole, we don't read all of 14 and 15 because it would take long in worship. I usually pick a section. I don't remember which section I picked this year, but you're getting another of these, and it fits what the idea of the reign of Christ is. And to me, with you, having put as much time into the story and the account of Mark, you're going to get to be able to see a payoff here at the end of all things, okay? Remember how I've talked about Jesus' entourage. If President Obama, President George H.W. Bush, if medieval kings had their entourage, remember how I've talked to you about Jesus' entourage. Remember what I've told you about the disciples? That in Mark, they are the duh-ciples. Like, they just don't get it. And I can really highlight that here at the end of Mark, and you can maybe think back and remember my talking about this. Let's talk, for example, about Judas, one of the disciples. Luke is another one of the Gospels that talks about Judas. John, I've already mentioned, is another different than Mark, is another Gospel that also talks about Judas. Both Luke and John say that Satan entered Judas, and that's when he betrayed Jesus. Both Luke and John say Satan did it, okay? And if you look those up, you'll see that. In Matthew, Judas doesn't deal with Satan, but Judas doesn't agree to betray Jesus until they say they'll give him 30 pieces of silver. So the other three Gospels have a different account. It's either the devil or it's money that makes him do it, right? Judas agrees to betray Jesus in Mark without any other additional outside temptation. He initiates it. There's no talk of the devil here. There's no being entered by Satan. There's no motivation by greed. Mark emphasizes that the betrayer is one at this table who is eating with me. He's one of the 12. He's one of the disciples. So remember I said that Mark paints this bad picture of the disciples. You can see it here at the end of all things in a much more detailed way. Jesus' entourage, his protection, his power, his company is susceptible to inner intrigue in a way that presidents' offices might be, but not to this degree really, right? We've never quite seen that. And so we're starting to see that contrast of what a king or a powerful person looks like and how God comes to us. And it's painting a picture of to you and I of who God is. The disciples in Mark, I can go on and on about this. I've talked about this, but we're at the end of all things and we're kind of seeing it up close and personal. Peter gets this same treatment in this section of the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus predicts Peter's denial in Mark, he says, today you're going to do this. He doesn't give them a warning. It isn't an ongoing teaching. He just says, you're going to do this. And those are only found in Mark, that word today. And then he even tells Peter, you're going to do it twice. He tells him this textually, story-wise, just a little, very, very short time before it actually happens. There's no big gap like there is in the other Gospels, like, oh, maybe Peter just forgot because a lot of time went by and Jesus is so cool, he was talking about other stuff. Jesus literally looks at him, says, today, you're going to do this. He tells him it twice in Mark, okay? And then it basically happens just a few reading minutes after that. It's a sudden change here. And again, it is a president's entourage. If they're warned and they do such a bad job so quickly, are they still around? Are they still in the entourage? If safety protocols are broken, or the inability to follow through is done, are those people going to be around a powerful king? No, Jesus has the duh-ciples. Jesus has the duh-ciples. A servant girl approaches Peter just a little bit after this warning, says, weren't you with him? She repeats it. Hey, I'm pretty sure you were with him. And he denies her, and he says, I don't know, I don't understand, I don't know what you're asking me. And so he comes off as a duh-ciple here. All the other disciples are in the same boat. It's not just these two. I've just picked out some of this. Mark tells us that in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asks them, he talks to them, and they don't know how to answer him when he talks to them. That's in this section. There is a section of Mark that is talked about a lot, and it comes just prior to the reading I've given you for this week. It's the end of chapter 14, and it is talked about a lot because we can't really figure out what it's about. This is Mark only. This text does not appear in any of the other Gospels, and it's strange. When you read it on Palm Passion Sunday, you should all be like, what in the heck is that all about? It is a story of a young man, it says. So look this up, end of Mark 14. A young man running away naked. That's literally what Mark 14 says. That a young man runs away from the Garden of Gethsemane, and Mark tells us that he's naked. And so that really makes you feel like the duh-ciples, like they're just ridiculous Keystone cops. They're not the body-armored, fully equipped presidential entourage. They are the disciples who flee naked and are stripped down and are just ridiculously laughable here, okay? There is a lot of talk in Mark and about Jesus' actual passion after the disciples, all this stuff happens. It's more violent in Mark than it is in any of the other Gospels. It's rougher. The treatment of Jesus by Pilate and Rome and by the scribes, Pharisees, by the crowds is way more rough, way more violent, way more rough than any of the other Gospels. So it really goes to the vulnerability of Jesus. It goes to the weakness of his entourage or his army. It goes to how vulnerable he is, and it really gives us a real feeling of who Jesus is, how Jesus works. And that is why I call this Reign of Christ and not Christ the King. Jesus does not come how then President Obama rolled into Lower Manhattan that day. Jesus does not come how then President George H.W. Bush rolled through the Akron airport that day. Jesus does not come how a medieval king would look. He doesn't come how Pilate might even be thinking a king would look. In Mark, the idea is where the disciples come off so bad, God's grace comes off so big. Disciples bad, God's grace must be so big to cover for even that, right? So where they're the disciples and it's all about weakness, for this to be God's love in weakness, the love must be so deep and so profound. Disciples bad at their job, Jesus, God's grace, bigger. So the worse they are, the more God's commitment has to be. It's not about power and protection. It's about the size of Jesus' grace. His vulnerability emphasizes that he'll go to every end necessary to love and accept and to draw in. This is God's entourage, and it is the duh-ciples. And this is good news because you and I can be, in our own way, the duh-ciples. We go to our days after worship, having heard the gospel, having sat before it, and we go right back to our old habits. We're the same. We deny Jesus like Peter. We are tempted by money, or as to say, Satan entered us like Judas. This happens to us too. And that's why the size of God's grace matters. That's why this is not about power and protection, kingship. It's about what God's kingdom looks like, all right? So this is what the reign of Christ is. It's about the size of God's grace and how big it is, and that it envelops us no matter how, even if we do come off like a little better than the disciples one day, oh, look at me, I did great, God's love would have covered it anyway. Because this is the story of who God is, not who people are, right? So here we are, we're at the end, and this is the last time that I will talk to you about Mark so pointedly. From here on out, the story I might reference Mark, but we're going to switch over to Luke beginning next week. So we're almost to Advent. Don't race ahead. Hear the fullness of the story and consider it. Do you think it should be called Christ the King or Reign of Christ? Do they say different things? Think about that day, June 15th, 2012. Power, protection. Have you ever come across the presidential motorcade or whatever? Have you ever seen how that all works? Can you hear the contrast of Jesus' motorcade? I mean, it's not a motorcade, but donkeycade. Can you see the contrast of it? And what does that say about God's willingness to go to such depths to provide grace? All right? So this is preparing for Sunday, November 21st. Thank you for joining me. It might be the end of the year, but we'll keep putting these out. The next time I see you this way, we'll be talking about Luke. But before we do, think about it. Christ the King, is that what you want to call it? Or do you think it's more about the reign of Christ? Take it easy. I appreciate you joining me. Stay safe, and I will see you soon.